What up, though? Shout out to all the snot swabbers, slob swabbers, black bliggity black pan African Americans who traced our ancestry bloodlines family by vomiting on the swabs with the tips made of cotton that Kunta Kinte and Chicken George picked. Let's shake it. The conversation. DNA tests make fun holiday gifts, but beware of the hype. Michael Mackley. Whether you're motivated to learn about your health or where your ancestors came from, it is important to understand how these tests work before you spit in the tube. While exciting, there are things that these genetic testing kits cannot tell users, and important personal implications that consumers should consider. And important personal implications that consumers should consider. My main area of research is around clinical genome sequencing. With a PhD in genetics, I often get questions from friends and family about which direct-to-consumer genetic tests they should buy, or requests to discuss results. That's a picture of your kit. For all of these tests, consumers receive a kit in the mail. The kits contain instructions for collecting a saliva sample, which you mail back to the company for analysis. During this analysis, these popular tests do not look at the entire genome. Instead, they employ single nucleotide polymorphism genotyping. As humans, we all share 99.9% of our DNA. SNPs are essentially what is left, all the points at which we can differ from our neighbor, making us unique. SNP genotyping looks at a subset of these sites to survey the user's genome. These SNPs are then compared to reference data sets of individuals with known conditions or ancestry. Most results are based on SNPs shared with a given group. For example, if your results say that you are 42% Southeast Asian, it's because 42% of your SNPs were most likely to have come from a group in the reference data set labeled Southeast Asian. The methods used differ dramatically from what is done to diagnose genetic diseases. In a clinical setting, when suspicion of a genetic condition is high, entire genes are often analyzed. Findings from direct-to-consumer genetic tests are often just statistical links. These tests are exciting, but for individual users, these are important caveats to consider. Identical twins can receive different results. Furthermore, a lack of diversity in the reference data has caused particular concern regarding accuracy of results for ethnic minorities. There are also concerns about the way these tests emphasize racial categories that science considers to be social constructs and biologically meaningless. In Canada, direct-to-consumer genetic testing is unregulated. These genetic testing kits are for entertainment. This is from Mail and Guardian. African Americans. Okay, let's go back. This is 2006, Mail and Guardian. African Americans using DNA kits to trace their roots. Gary Young. Oprah is a Zulu. Never mind that she was born and raised in Mississippi, and her great grandparents hailed from no further away than Georgia and North Carolina. Miss Winfrey, the queen of the televised confessional, is not just suggesting her lineage might stretch back thousands of years to a specific African tribe. She is asserting it as a definitive fact. I always wondered what it would be like if it turned out I am a South African. Mommy Africa? I feel so at home here. Do you know that I actually am one? She told an audience of 3,200 in Johannesburg last year. I went in search of my roots and had my DNA tested, and I am a Zulu. Over the past few years, laboratories have begun to amass a database of DNA samples from around the world, including parts of West Africa. The technology aims either to trace a person's lineage through their genes or compile a statistical breakdown by geographical region of their genetic makeup. Mark Shriver describes himself as white, but his own test revealed that his DNA is 86% white, but also 11% West African and 3% Indigenous American. For most people, it is consistent with what they've thought, he says. How the West African DNA got into my family line was never explained to me. The science, now commercially available, has become something of a boom industry. 2 years ago, I swabbed my cheek with something that felt like a cotton bud and sent it off to a Washington based organization called African Ancestry. Several weeks later, it sent me a letter telling me that the Y chromosome DNA sequence that we determined from your sample matches with the Hausa people in Nigeria. This result meant that you have inherited through your father a segment of DNA that was passed on consistently from father to son to you. This segment of DNA is presently found in Africa in Nigeria. They also sent me a map showing me where Nigeria is and a certificate of ancestry declaring that I share paternal genetic ancestry with the Hausa people in Nigeria. It went on. You can display it with pride among other important family documents. Elsewhere in the letter, however, came information that would seem to minimize the entire enterprise, if not negate it altogether. The Y chromosome may represent less than 1% of your entire genetic makeup, it said. I've spoken with African Americans who have tried 4 or 5 different genetic genealogy companies and received results each time and kept going until they got a result they were happy with. I've spoken with African Americans who have tried 4 or 5 different genetic genealogy companies, received different results each time, and kept going until they got a result they were happy with that made them feel all cottony inside. Which brings us back to Oprah. Last week, she gave author James Frey a dressing down on her couch for the memoir he wrote, and she helped promote that turned out to owe far more to fiction than fact. Angry and at times tearful, Oprah asked the author of to A Million Little Pieces explain why he felt the need to lie. It is difficult for me to talk to you because I really feel duped, she said. But more importantly, I feel that you betrayed millions of readers. Whatever Oprah's belief about her ancestry, her assertion that she is Zulu is no less misleading. There is little in the way of genetic lineage that comes close to matching a particular linguistic group such as the Zulu nation. When Oprah had her DNA tested for the program, the results suggested her most likely match was from the Kapelish tribe of Liberia. Instead, she was told that she could not have come from South Africa. None of this is likely to stop her claiming Zulus as her kith and kin. I'm crazy about the South African accent, she said. I wish I had been born here. Cape Cod Times. Skepticism led women to send dog DNA to Origin. Scientists question the reliability of direct-to-consumer genetic testing analysis. Jeanette Hinkle, Daily News Staff, 2020. Genetic counselor Katie Stoll was skeptical when she bought an at-home genetics test kit from a company called Origin in December 2017. Stoll, working on her own, eventually submitted 2 samples to Origin for analysis. First, she sent the company a swab from her mixed breed dog, Ginger, then later a sample of tap water from her kitchen sink. Neither of the samples were identified as non-human by Origin lab employees. Stoll is a board-certified genetic counselor who now works as executive director for the Genetic Support Foundation, a nonprofit based in Olympia, Washington. Stoll, as a consumer, wanted to see if the company was forthright about the potential risk and limitations of the kind of genetic testing it offered. Origin CEO Robin Smith said last week that while the type of DNA analysis his company offers is relatively new, it provides one tool among many to help people make decisions about their lives. The philosophy and culture here is, let's optimistically look at how you make yourself better, which is what everybody's interested in, he said. It's just another tool in that approach. We want you to feel like what you feel like you are. Sarah Nelson is a senior research scientist at the University of Washington, specializing in the ethical and social implications of genomics. Nelson said, but overall, the genetics community has reservations about genetic testing, billed as being able to advise people about their predisposition to certain traits. Lindsay Ferrer, a medical geneticist and Boston University's chief of biomedical genetics, said direct-to-consumer genetic testing often misleads customers because the companies use population-level data from studies about genetic links to certain traits or diseases and wrongly apply that data into risk assessments for random individuals. Usually, the studies used by companies like Origin are based on very specific populations that don't always represent the range of people ordering the test. My conclusion would be buyer beware. Stoll said she didn't trust Origin with her child's DNA or her own, so instead she swabbed the cheek of her dog Ginger. After sending the kit containing Ginger's DNA to Origin, she got a full report back from the company on January 18, 2018 about the dog's genetic profile, which showed, among other things, that she was likely to have mild struggles with reading. She ordered another childhood development kit and sent in a sample of tap water from her kitchen sink on March 17, 2018. Again, she got a full report back from Origin. According to the report, the tap water would need longer to develop skills required for language learning. It is beyond incompetence. If they're getting DNA out of tap water, then that's bacterial DNA, and that is clearly different from human DNA. This is from Indigenous American DNA. Having Native American ancestors or Indigenous American DNA does not make someone a Native American tribal citizen. Keep in mind the distinction that this article is making between Native American and Indigenous American. Native American tribal members are citizens of their nations. This is a political and cultural identification rather than a genetic identification. For many tribal nations, this means tracing a person's lineage back to someone on tribal citizenship rolls from the late 19th to early 20th centuries, like the Dawes roll. That's from support.ancestry.com. There's a crucial difference between the claims, "I have Native American lineage," and "I am Native American." No tribal nation considers Indigenous American DNA to be a legitimate claim to citizenship. I wonder why. Do you? You already know. Maybe. Many Native Americans have some European ancestors. Many Native Americans have some European ancestors, as opposed to Indigenous Americans or American Indians. It's possible to have Native American ancestors but not have the Indigenous Americans region in your ethnicity estimate. This is because there's a difference between lineage and DNA, between bloodline and DNA, between genealogy and DNA. Let's say you have a Native American great grandmother who has 25% Indigenous American DNA. Distinction made between Native American and Indigenous American. The Ancestry DNA test survey over 700,000 locations in your DNA, but there is still a chance that we missed evidence of Indigenous American DNA. This is because you may have inherited genetic markers that Ancestry DNA does not use to identify Indigenous American ethnicity. The presence of Indigenous DNA does not make someone more or less Native American. I wonder why. Do you? The presence of Indigenous DNA does not make someone more or less Native American. Native, you were born here. Anyone can be a native of somewhere, if that's where you were born. For Native American populations, many Native Americans have some European ancestors. The New York Times, DNA gatherers hit snag. Tribes don't trust them. Amy Harmon, 2006, South Naknek, Alaska. Billed as the moonshot of anthropology, the Genographic Project intends to collect 100,000 indigenous DNA samples. At issue is geographic origin stories told by DNA can clash with long held beliefs, threatening a worldview some indigenous leaders see as vital to preserving their culture. They argue that genetic ancestry information could also jeopardize land rights and other benefits that are based on the notion that their people have lived in a place since the beginning of time. What if it turns out you're really Siberian and then, oops, your health care is gone, said Dr. David Barrett, a co-chairman of the Alaska Area Institutional Review Board, which is sponsored by the Indian Health Service, a federal agency. Scientific evidence that American Indians or other Aboriginal groups came from elsewhere, they say, could undermine their moral basis for sovereignty and chip away at their collective legal claims. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but I find it interesting how these different terms are used interchangeably. American Indian, Indigenous American, Native American. There are differences. Not so much with American Indians or Indigenous Americans, but between those two and Native American. Let's shake it. When the North American team arrived in southwestern Alaska, they found volunteers offering cheek swabs and family histories for all sorts of reasons. The council members of the native village of Georgetown, for instance, thought the project could bolster a sense of cultural pride. Others said the test would finally force an acknowledgement that they were here first, undermining those who see the government as having given them their land. American Indians, Dr. Schur said, hold the answer to one of the more notable gaps in the prehistoric migration map. Although most scientists accept that the first Americans came across the Bering Strait land bridge that connected Siberia and Alaska some 20,000 years ago, there is no proof of precisely where those travelers came from and the route they took south once they arrived. Comparing the DNA of large numbers of American Indians might reveal Comparing the DNA of large numbers of Native Americans might reveal whether their ancestors were from a single founding population and when they reached the Americas. And knowing the routes and timing of migrations with the Americans would provide a foundation for studying how people came to be so different so quickly. But almost every federally recognized tribe in North America has declined or ignored Dr. Schur's invitation to take part. What the scientists are trying to prove is that we're the same as the Pilgrims, except we came over several thousand years before, said Maurice Fox, chairman of the Massachusetts Commission on Indian Affairs and a member of the Mashpee Wampanoag. Why should we give them that openly? Some American Indians, some Native Americans trace their suspicions to the experience of the Havasupai tribe, whose members gave DNA for a diabetes study that University of Arizona researchers later used to link the tribe's ancestors to Asia. You don't look like no Asian, do you? You don't look like nobody from Asia, regardless of where in Asia they talking about. Because we all know Asia comprises a lot of different places, a lot of different so-called countries. Let's shake it. Mongolian, Mongolian. Look. Mongolian. Let's shake it. Siberian, Siberian, as follows. Siberian, Siberian. Native American, Native American. Native American. Let's shake it. Who's taking the pictures? Native American. Ah, yeah. The two braids make it legit, right? Native Americans, the two braids that make it legit. Maybe. Now on to the chiefs of the Native Americans. The chiefs. Native American. The University of Chicago magazine, Long Way Home. Chicago geneticist Rick Kittle stirs controversy and hope with a DNA database designed to help African Americans unearth their roots. Reverend Al Sampson arrived in Lunsur, Sierra Leone on a sunny December day in 2005. It was reasonably hot, 85 degrees or so, and the streets were muddy. A small crowd gathered as he stepped from the car, wearing a cobalt blue safari suit and carrying a folder filled with papers. The village elders were expecting him. More than a year and a half earlier, Sampson had swabbed the inside of his cheek. Shout out to the slob swabbers and the snot swabbers. With the sterile foam pad, which he mailed off to African Ancestry, a Silver Spring, Maryland-based company that uses genetic testing to trace African Americans' genealogical roots. 6 weeks later, he got a letter from company president Gina Page informing him that his DNA indicated a common ancestry with Sierra Leone's Temne tribe. African Americans are unearthing their ancestry in growing numbers, and increasingly they're using genetics to do so. In the past 6 years, some 24 DNA testing companies have sprung up, offering to help people of all ethnicities reestablish long-severed links to their past. As of this past October, more than 260,000 Americans had paid for genealogical genetic testing. For African Americans, DNA's promise is particularly seductive. People are riveted by the possibility that they can find the tribe they're descended from, says Harvard University African American Studies professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. But the Middle Passage prevented us from really finding out. Between the western shore of Africa and the eastern shore of America, names, identities, and religions vanished. Now, for the first time in 3 centuries, Gates says, we can begin to reverse the Middle Passage. In 2006, listen, between the western shore of Africa and the eastern shore of America, names, identities, and religions vanished. Now, for the first time in 3 centuries, Gates says, we can begin to reverse the Middle Passage. Reverse it? Who said it was given to us in reverse? Y'all know, homie, who said it. Homie who told us that they did it in reverse, he said he was just here to make you think. In 2006, he featured African Ancestry in African American Lives, a PBS documentary on Black Americans' search for their roots. 11 million people watched as celebrities such as Oprah Winfrey, Quincy Jones, and Chris Tucker submitted their DNA, submitted their vomica for the company's analysis. Sampson decided to take a genetics test after attending a 2004 presentation at Chicago's South Shore Cultural Center, given by Page and African Ancestry co-founder Rick Kittles, then a geneticist at Ohio State University. The two talked about science and history and finding a sense of place, says Sampson. That resonated. Sampson, as a civil rights organizer during the 1960s, met with Lunsar's 40 elders, all but one of them men. All but one of them men, and all Muslim, save one Christian. He showed them the paperwork he'd gotten from African ancestry, the certificate attesting to his Timni lineage. I told them 500 years ago my DNA was removed from here by slave traders and taken to America, so I'm coming back for my seat, Sampson recalls. He brought his paperwork. He had the paperwork. Kittles, who joined Chicago's faculty in 2006. He mounted his own research trips to the continent too, concentrating on its western territory, from which so many millions of African slaves had been captured and shipped to America. Kittles earned his PhD in 1998 and took a job as assistant professor of microbiology at Howard University. He also became co-director of the Molecular Genetics Unit at the university's National Human Genome Center. While at Howard, one project in particular pushed Kittles into business. In 1997, he joined a research team examining remains from a colonial-era black cemetery that once occupied 6 acres of lower Manhattan. Construction workers accidentally unearthed the graveyard in September 1991 while bulldozing the foundation for a federal office tower. And by the following summer, archaeologists dug up more than 400 graves. They robbed more than 400 graves, exhumed 400 graves. What if you go do that? Can you go do that? Can you go dig up one grave? What'll happen to you? Historical records suggest that between 1640 and 1795, as many as 15,000 slaves were laid to rest in the New York African burial ground. Laid to rest until they got there. After the cemetery closed, it was paved over as the burgeoning city expanded. Following public outcry over the federal government's haphazard excavation, that's words are so cute. Let's shake it. And some dismay that the graves had been disturbed at all. The remains were turned over to Howard researchers for more systematic examination. Anthropologists pored over the caskets, finding signs of ancient African rituals, really, in the toys and tools buried with the dead, the coins placed in their hands. From rough-etched bones, scientists constructed stories of hunger and back-breaking labor. Kittle's job was to isolate DNA from the skeletons and determine whether their origins were African American, Indian, or European. In 2003, the remains were re-entered. And this past October, a monument was dedicated at the site. Come on, man. What came from it? What did you learn from it? You just go from grave robbing to erecting a monument. But you know what? It's in Manhattan. I remember ODB, one of the best to ever do it, say his people, and he said that he was Shinnecock, said his people sold Manhattan for trinkets. Kittles launched African Ancestry in February 2003. He had tried out his ancestry test on a few subjects, among them his parents. Like many African Americans, we knew nothing about where in Africa our ancestors were from, he says. Oral history traced the family from New York, where Kittles grew up, to Georgia, where he was born and his grandparents lived. Oral history traced the family from New York, where Kittles grew up, to Georgia, where he was born and his grandparents lived. Kittle's analysis can't always narrow clients' genetic paths to a particular tribe. Failing that, he says, he is able to specify the present day country their DNA points to. Kittle's analysis can't always narrow clients' genetic paths to a particular tribe. But failing that, he says, he is able to specify the present day country their DNA points to. The 25,000 samples he's collected represent 389 ethnic groups from more than 30 countries, most in West and Central Africa. Several thousand ethnic groups exist throughout the continent, sometimes as many as 20 or 30 in a single country. Some people come to African Ancestry page says to confirm oral histories about American Indians in the family, but the tests rarely bear them out. Others are looking for an ancestor from a particular African tribe. Most clients, to many of them, what Kittles offers isn't merely scientific information. It's a missing fragment of identity. For African Americans, it's hard to make that African connection. I wonder why, says Reverend Sampson. They know their ancestors were from Africa. They feel like it. Y'all feel like it. But they can't get past South Carolina or Mississippi. Damn. For Sampson, in 2006, he took African Ancestry's Y chromosome test and was told his DNA matched with Nigeria's Igbo people. He's planning a trip there this year. Troy Duster, a New York University sociologist who served on the committee advising the Human Genome Project on social and ethical issues and who has called genetic testing proponents Pied Pipers of genealogical certainty. An article in October 19th Science, co-authored by 14 anthropologists, sociologists, including Duster, bioethicists, and legal scholars, summed up the skeptics' case. Most tests, they wrote, can trace only a few ancestors out of thousands and likely won't identify every place or group that matches a client's genetic profile. You mean what? You mean that the test won't connect you to dirt or soil or sand? Your vomit won't connect you to sand or soil? Many consumers do not realize, the authors wrote, that the tests are probabilistic, and can reach incorrect conclusions. Kittles, since he first pondered the database's commercial prospects, he's been part of an intensifying public debate over genetics' role in genealogy. Let's go to the bottom. Sampson has read the critical press about Kittle's work. In October, he watched an episode of CBS's 60 Minutes in which a woman wept on camera when African Ancestry traced her lineage to Sierra Leone. Then she learned other companies traced it elsewhere, to Senegal and Ivory Coast. Sampson says, I saw it as a way of trying to put water on our flame, Sampson says. Sampson has read the critical press about Kittle's work. In October, he watched an episode of CBS's 60 Minutes in which a woman, I think her name was Vi, I saw that episode. A woman, she wept on camera When African Ancestry traced her lineage to Sierra Leone, she said, don't quote me on this, but she said, now I have a place that I can call home or something to that extent. Then she learned other companies traced it elsewhere to Senegal and Ivory Coast. Sampson says, after seeing this, I saw it as a way of trying to put water on our fire, Sampson says. Let's go back up. Kittles acknowledges, Kittles, the co-founder of African Ancestry, Kittles acknowledges that for all its restorative promise, genetic testing has limitations. I mean, we're talking about a very small part of your DNA, he says. Less than 0.01%. We talking about our families here. Stop being lazy. Don't take shortcuts. Do the right thing.